Good morning, members of the MCA. One of the, if not perhaps the principal function of the president of the organisation is that he takes the chair at the annual general meeting. We're extremely proud to have Sir Michael Marmot, such a distinguished international scientist, as our president, and he's very supportive. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here this morning, so you have to make do with one of the two vice presidents, i.e. me. So, good morning and welcome to the AGM. I feel a bit like the chairman introducing the first speaker and saying, shall I announce you straight away, or shall we give them another 5 minutes to enjoy themselves? I need to tell you that the toilets are this way and the fire escape is that way, just in case. And don't confuse the two. Thank you very much for coming. We have, in addition to Sir Michael's, we have, I think it's how many, there's quite a number of apologies, haven't we? So I turn now to the minutes of the last meeting, which you will have. Do they have them on the chair? They're in the annual report anyway. They're very good, clear minutes. Are there any questions of fact? Thank you. Does anybody wish to raise any question regarding the minutes of that meeting? No? Thank you. In that case, we accept the minutes. Can I have a proposer for acceptance of the minutes, please? Thank you, Dr. Murray Lyon. Yes, and a seconder, Dr. Alan Thompson. Thank you. Perhaps the most important part of our business is keeping our heads above water, which we've done with some success, I think. And with pleasure, introduce our new treasurer. Graham has been with us since June, and he'll tell you about himself, but he's very good breath of fresh air, and we can understand his proposals about the budget. For the first time, I'm beginning to understand the science of our finances. Graham.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Victor Borge, the Danish humorist and musician, was once asked whether he minded people looking at their watches when he was performing. And he said no, he only started worrying when they started shaking them. So with that image in mind, I will endeavour to be brief. I think the first point to make is that MCA is in a very strong financial position. And whatever else you take away from my discussion or presentation this morning, please hold that thought in your mind. At the end of March 2014, the total funds of the MCA compared to the previous year had increased by something like 3.6% compared to the previous year. And we had an overall surplus, after all expenses, all income, and all investment gains and losses, of roughly £28,000. That was quite a lot lower than the previous year, and I think as we'll see as we go through, previous year was somewhat flattered by significant investment gains and also a higher level of donations than in the year just ended. Broadly, our non-investment income, that is the income from the journal, subscriptions and donations, in total was little changed from the previous year. I think we had about £164,000 compared to £168,000 in the previous year. Quite an increase in investment income, more than double, and the reason for that is because the 2013-14 year was the first year in which we'd had a fully invested portfolio, and therefore we got dividends for the full year. Our expenses went up somewhat compared to the previous year, in part due to just general cost inflation, also an increase in the investment management costs, again because we had the portfolio invested for a full year. And as I said at the beginning, our net investment gains, whilst still healthy at almost £62,000, were somewhat less than the previous year when markets really had run away and our portfolio returns reflected that. So if we look at the analysis of income, where is it coming from? I think it's fair to say that both for 2012-13 and also 2013-14, the majority of the income, that's 70% or more, comes from our profit share in the journal, Alcohol and Alcoholism. As I've said before, donations compared in the last year compared to the previous year had gone down somewhat, and that was more or less covered, that decline was more or less covered by an increase in investment income. Publications and seminars were broadly the same over both years. These boxes, I think is probably the best way of describing them, give an indication of what kind of income that we've been coming from. I have to say the scaling on these is not as I would wish, but it gives an indication, in fact, of the kind of income that we've been getting from these sources. And the same again, as you can see, if you look at the screen, principally we're getting about £140,000 in the last year from the journal. Perhaps will be a bit less this year. And again, as I've said before, we had a significant increase in investment income. Turning to expenses, it will come as perhaps no surprise that staff costs in total are probably our largest component of expenditure. Direct governance covers what I would call a multitude of sins, including the costs of the managing the investment portfolio, and we continue to spend quite heavily on the MCA's main charitable activities. And again, and this gives in number terms, where most of it is spent, and as you can see, there's in excess of 40% that is going on headcount, premises, and other office costs. And probably if you take those three categories together, we are talking about perhaps over 70% of MCA's total costs being covered by those headings. That was really a repetition of what I've just said. So if we look to the future, I think first of all, one of the points that I've made to the Executive Committee, and they're probably already fed up with me of banging on about it, is that we are making deficits before investment gains. We can't always rely on market movements, upward market movements, if you like, to cover those deficits. And so we need to think about ways of reducing the gap, really. So whilst continued tight cost control is important, it's not the solution. You can only go so far, if you like, with good housekeeping. So we're giving consideration to generating other sources of income to help close that gap. But at the end of all this, the thought that I started with is the thought that I will leave you with. MCA is in a strong financial position, and that gives us the opportunity to think carefully about how we close this gap. We don't have to make what I would loosely call any knee-jerk decisions. I think 5 minutes on accounts is probably as much as anyone deserves at this time of the morning. So does anyone have any questions, or if you prefer, please come and talk to me later on during the day, and I'll be happy to explain things. Board into submission already. It just leaves one other item of business to do, please, which is the reappointment of Goldwins as our reviewing accountants. We don't have auditors, we have reviewing accountants. Goldwins have been reviewing and advising MCAs on MCA's accounts for probably more years than they care to remember, and have been very helpful to me coming on board as Treasurer. So Peter, if you could possibly ask for someone to both propose and then second their reappointment, I'd be grateful.
The proposer, thank you, Dr. Brian Hoare. Seconder, Professor Robin Tucker.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham, for that very clear exposition.
Thank you.
Thank you for what you are doing for the organisation. Thank you. The success of any organisation depends on the people who are actually running it, and not the people who stand on the sidelines like myself. And it's been a great pleasure to me in the years since Dominique came here to see how we've advanced under her care as medical director. So I call upon Dominique to give her statement.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Graham. This is my 5th year as medical director, and when I was interviewed for the role by Peter and others, I was warned that the job may only last 4 years, so I think this is an improvement. We've done better than that. But of course, we do need to heed what we might call Graham's gap, I suppose, and think about how we're going to address that. The half sale of the journal is responsible for why I'm still here after 4 years, and that was obviously a huge boon. It's allowed us to continue and indeed expand our activities. What it's also done is bought us time and allowed us to think a little bit more strategically going forward, and I'm going to refer to both those trends of our work. So just a quick overview of our activities, just a reminder. Firstly, the symposium where we're here today. Last year's symposium was the most successful ever, both in terms of numbers and in terms of actually having made a very small profit, but nevertheless a profit at the end of the day. And that was due to fantastic organisation, the change to all attenders actually paying something, and we hope to continue that. I think the position of most successful symposium ever will probably be overtaken at the end of today by today's event. So I'm hoping that this will be a good day. And just to say, you've also got a reminder in your packs of a save the date for next year's already, if you want to put that in your diary, on the topic of alcohol, health, work and well-being, which I think will be excellent. We have 2 newsletters now. We have the sort of older sibling, I suppose, Alcoholis, which goes out 4 times a year to members. It's both online and a few printed copies as well, and the younger sibling, Alcoholomania, which is for medical students, is an entirely digital enterprise. We're always happy to have any suggestions for articles, any contributions, of course. We have a new student editor for Alcoholomania, who I think is coming later, Jade Woolley, who's a medical student at Southampton, so that's fantastic that she's taken that on. The symposium and the newsletters are very much under the auspices of the Education Committee. Particularly the symposium is planned and organised by the Education Committee. I don't think Anne McCune, who chairs that, is here today, but you know, they're very responsible for this stream of work. The website, we have upgraded that a couple of years ago, so it is much more functional. That's useful for the office and hopefully also for those that want to look at it. It's a pretty simple website, and I have taken the view that because we're a pretty small organisation, it's very difficult for us to have an all-singing, all-dancing website that's kept up to date, and I'd rather have something simpler that's actually up to date and not needing constantly doing, because it's very difficult to manage that. Nevertheless, it's probably an underused resource for us, and I think that's something going forward that we would need to look at, trying to get the website more active than it is and think of ways that we might do that. What else have we got? Sort of moving on to thinking again about the strategy element. As I say, the half sale to OUP has allowed us time to think forward. What is our strategy? What's our vision? And this, you've probably all by now seen this. This is an iteration, which is, I hope, the final one for the moment. And it sort of crystallises, I think, two things. One is that we have now agreed that our audience legitimately encompasses not just doctors and medical students, but other health professionals also, whether in training or qualified. And I think that's important and reflects the scope of alcohol work as it's going on now. The other thing it's done is really crystallised our work streams into the sort of four key areas. Education, of course, that's our prime function. Also research through the journal, policy work, mainly with other organisations who are more active in the policy sphere on things like minimum unit price. And historically, we've got a strong link with organisations that support doctors and medical students with alcohol problems themselves. We've got Alistair Young, who's on our executive and is here today from the Sick Doctors Trust. So those are our four streams, and I think it has been helpful to really pin those down, and we're going to come back to that at the end when I talk about rebranding. Looking now at a couple of our sort of most important outputs. Firstly, I hope known to you all, the Alcohol and Health Handbook, and we've spent a bit of time this year thinking about that and where we go with that. It's, of course, an absolutely key MCA output. It's one of the first sort of educational functions that we distribute it to medical students. It's self-published. The last edition was published by the MCA together with support from the Royal Free Hospital, and we're hugely dependent, of course, on the two main authors' goodwill, basically, Bruce, who's here, and Marshall Morgan, who I think is not yet. We did a print run of 30,000 of them in 2009. We've now got about 10,000 left. And I'm going to come back to this last point about the unpredictable demand, really. We mainly, we mainly rely on medical students to call us for orders and distribute it at no cost to medical schools. We charge medical schools £2 a copy. You can also buy it, and we do sell a small proportion, but over 90% go to medical schools for, as I say, £2 a copy. So the good news is, on the initial print run of 30,000, which cost us about 30,000, and there was an additional 7,000 to 10,000 on distribution costs, we've actually recouped now. We've made that money back, and anything that we distribute or sell now is profit on top of that. And currently that stands at over 5,000, which I think is a very impressive result. So that's the good news. The slightly less good news is that we've looked at orders coming in over the last few years, and there does seem to be a dip in the last year. We're not quite sure why. It may just be a blip. If you look at 2012, it wasn't as good as the other years, but it's not quite as bad now as it was a couple of months ago. So maybe as the academic year's kicked off, more medical schools are contacting us. But it certainly looks like there might be a bit of a tailing off. It's difficult for us because we don't know exactly why. We've tried to find out. It's possible that medical schools have over-ordered previously and have got remaining stock. We have had medical schools saying they don't have the money, even at £2 a copy, to buy it anymore. So if that continues to be a trend, that's something that we need to look at. It's difficult to chase up. Safi has contacted our regional advisors, and we've contacted the universities. The trouble is, orders come from all different departments. We never quite know who's going to put in the order. It's rather we're sort of dependent on them contacting us, despite our attempts to contact them. And admin staff at universities do change year to year. So, it's not fantastic. So I'm going to go through all of these. There are a number of handbook issues. I'm not going to dwell on this slide because I think Colin's going to talk a bit more about how we're going to take this forward. But there are a few issues, what we do with the remaining stock, the electronic versus digital, the fact that we're not probably maximising the impact both to existing audiences and possibly to new audiences, and therefore perhaps the financial return. And the fact that at the MCA, we're not book distributors, and we're quite a small organisation. It is difficult for us to absolutely maximise the impact of the handbook. And I think Colin's going to talk more about that. Secondly, our other sort of main product, the journal, and I make no apologies for repeating Graham's slide. Thinking back to one of Clinton's campaigns, it's the economy stupid. For us, it's the journal stupid. Really, it's perfectly obvious that the journal is our major stream, both in terms of the annual income and in terms of the investment income from the half sale. So it's a hugely precious resource, and one that we need to ensure continues and grows. Again, I think Colin's going to talk about journal and going forward. We have a journal committee that meets twice a year, chaired by Brian, who is here. But obviously, it's not just what happens twice a year at the journal committee. It's an absolute blessing, I think, that OUP bought the half share, not just for the money, because it's enabled us to work much more closely with OUP. They're clearly a publisher of world-class standing, and they are fantastic partners in this endeavour. We have a lot of contact with them through the year. Our editors, we now have 3, Jonathan Chick, Philippe DeWitt and Lorenzo Leggio in the States. None of them are here today, but clearly the journal would be not what it is without their input. And our impact factor, I'm pleased to say, from a dip below 2 last year has now crept over 2, and we hope very much that this is an upward trend. To give you an idea of the scale of the enterprise, in 2013 they processed more than 300 articles, probably a few less this year because there isn't a special issue. Of those, between a quarter and a third get accepted. But it's, they're looking at a lot of articles, and we may not always be the first source of submission for authors, but we're up there enough to get a substantial number of articles. And I know Colin's going to talk a bit more about the journal going forward. Moving on now to a rather different area, one of the things that we've done more of in the last couple of years than we had previously is go to conferences, take an MCA stand, like this one, or the one you see outside. Normally it would have Safi standing next to it. And that's been an interesting exercise, really. We've learnt a lot about the sort of costs and benefits of having stands. Sometimes we have a stand, sometimes we put material in delegate packs. It's very resource intensive if one of us actually has to go. For a small office, that's a lot. And the problem is the benefits are not always obvious, and they're not always predictable. We get a lot of members saying, oh, there's a conference going on here, you simply must come, it'll be a fantastic source. Actually, we don't know. Sometimes we sell books, sometimes we don't, sometimes people join or come to the symposium. It's a difficult one. But one thing it has sort of highlighted for us is the fact that the MCA as a brand is not well recognised amongst a professional group working with alcohol who one would feel should recognise it. We hopefully are there to support their educational needs and others. And that's really the hypothesis behind this rebrand. Why is it needed? We would like people to identify clearly who the MCA is, what our products are. Often people will know the journal or may know the handbook and don't realise that actually this is somehow related to the MCA. And there's a lack of consistency at the moment. Even if you look at the stand outside, all our products look slightly different. And we've decided that it would be good to rebrand. The process has been that we went to the executive who approved the project. Safi and I have interviewed a number of design companies, which was interesting, and we've selected a particular one based in Portsmouth. We've worked with them. The first stage was working with them, producing, telling them all about us and producing some mock-ups. They took them to the executive, I think, in October, and there were a couple of suggestions. And before you get too excited about the one on your left, it's the one on the right that we've chosen. So that's the one the executive was fairly unanimous in going with. And we're now taking that forward. And the next slide shows some of the, what am I supposed to, yeah, we've got some mock-ups here, some of the ways in which it's going to be implemented. We've got some mock-ups if people want to look at those later. There's a sort of colour coding with sort of education, journal and policy in different colours and support. The black one is so that it can go on the journal on a red background, so it'll be, you can't put green on a red background. And there's really a whole suite of materials that we need to work with the design company so that it works, whether it's for the handbook or the journal, for postcards, competition leaflets, the whole thing. There's quite a big job. It's got to work for the website. And this is in the way of really a preview, a sneak preview for next year. We hope that the rebrand will be actually launched this time next year. We'd be interested in your opinions, not perhaps to go back to square one because we are where we are, but if you have any thoughts, do please let me know. And that work's going to be going on over the coming year. Finally, one more thing, student competitions, of course, a hardy perennial of the MCA. I was a judge on the essay competition. We've got winners of both the essay and the NAAD this year, I'm happy to say. The essay competition on the reasons why UK might be the binge drinking capital of Europe. We had a very high standard of entry. Ian Smith and Jenny Lyle were also judges. And the NAAD competition was to produce some web pages on Wernicke-Korsakoff for our website. We're currently working at integrating the winning entry into the website. Next year, it's Are We Daft to Drink? I think an interesting title on the dissonance between the evidence and behaviour around alcohol. Please do promote that to any student you know who might wish to enter it. Finally, the MCA would not be what it is without the people that make it up. We're a small membership organisation, about 120 members. We have had discussions about whether one approach to income generation would be to grow the membership. I think the view at the moment is that's probably not that we don't welcome members, but it's probably not the main way forward in terms of income. But I think we do have an active membership. I counted up how many board members there were amongst the membership, and there were about 30. So about a quarter of our members are actually active in the organisation, which is actually a high proportion. None more so, of course, than the committee chairs, for whom we're very grateful. And of course, we've got the regional advisors, which is our network of clinicians and researchers around the country who are linking us with the medical schools. It's not perfect. We have to work quite hard to involve them. We've got a meeting at lunchtime, which Ian Smith, as Chief RA, is going to be chairing. I think it is getting more difficult, that's my impression, for relatively younger colleagues in research or in clinical posts to actually be able, not I think out of lack of goodwill, to provide the time that it's needed to get involved with the MCA. I think that's something we have to work with and we have to think about. We do need both the sort of older, retired level of input and the sort of younger ones. Some manage it, but I know it's very difficult. I think Anne McCune, I'm not sure, is coming today simply because, despite being chair of education, she is just so busy in her clinical work. Finally, of course, I have to thank the office, which, aka Safi, really, there's no one else. No one can have failed to be impressed by her commitment and energy in all this, whether it's organising today or all the other things that the MCA office does. You may not know, but she's also organising another event in her own life, which is her wedding next year at the same time. And based on how she's done here, I'm quite sure that's going to be quite an event as well. So that's it from me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Any questions for Dominic? Robin.
I think we're to youth and beauty.
Is it worth just knowing which medical schools get or buy the journal?
Yes,
that journal?
by the handbook.
By the handbook,
Yes.
actually. Because otherwise, I'd certainly be interested to know about the department.
Fantastic. Our problem is we don't know who. We have contacted all the RAs in all the different universities, but as you say, there are individuals who say, "Oh no, I could use them." So,
Yeah, it'd be quite, I wouldn't say it'd be worth knowing Imperial or student technology.
yes, yes,
In that area.
sure.
Robin.
Whilst I'm not a regional advisor myself, having sat between Karim Dar, who's involved in teaching Imperial College School of Medicine medical students, and Peter Crow, who's a past Dean of the Medical School at Keele University, I hope that the Regional Advisors meeting at lunchtime today will focus on ways of getting a presence into the medical school to fight for time on the curriculum for the question of alcohol, which so easily gets squeezed out by selfish colleagues fighting for time for their own particular whatever.
Yes, I mean, I think we're quite aware that with regional advisors, they've got two roles. One is to work with the students, but also to work with faculty, curriculum committees and so on, to sort of manage upwards.
But I just hope that might be included on the agenda.
Yes, I mean, we've talked about it, and it's an important, distinction, those two roles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any? Yes, Mike.
I just want to endorse the use of the new logo. I think it's important always to put the words the MCA with the Medical Council on Alcohol. Otherwise, you get confused with the Maritime Coast Guard Agency.
Well, there are some similarities.
The lifeboat, what it is for health. Not really.
Any other questions? Dominic, thank you very much. Thank you. So you see, really, you had a peep into what actually goes on, and really it's very impressive, I think. I'm sorry, I should have said before I began to request that you turn off all electronic apparatus, lasers, comet detectors, and of course mobile phones, if you wouldn't mind turning them off in deference to the speakers. We are indeed privileged to have somebody of international name as our chairman, and his contribution to the field of addiction is enormous. Colin, thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Good morning, all. I'll be very brief. I'm going to just talk about some of the strategic work that we've been doing over the last year, mainly. Also report on some changes of personnel, and just to thank our sponsors. So, last year at the AGM, we talked a little bit about an away day that we'd had in September. So the executive committee spent a day just really reviewing where the MCA had come from, what its mission was, and whether that mission was still appropriate today. And I think much of what was originally planned for the MCA as an organisation really is still relevant today. But I think in this first meeting that we had in September 13, we felt it important to emphasise that we should build on what we do best, rather than necessarily trying to do everything. We had a follow-up in June 2014 this year, and really the purpose of that was to try and refine this down to some actions, some clear things that we could do over the next 2 years or so in order to move that agenda forward. And I'll go through each of these strategic things. So in terms of financial strategy, first of all, I should say that I'm delighted that Graham Warner accepted our invitation to be our treasurer. He really has been absolutely superb, and his clarity with the finances is most welcome. We have never had a finance committee within the MCA. It's always been a kind of an add-on to the executive, but with the part sale of the journal to Oxford University Press and developing quite a large portfolio of investments which are being managed by Charles Stanley, we set up a finance group really to look at the investments, but we felt actually that group was doing a lot of thinking about the financial strategy as well, so that it actually justified having a new official MCA committee, finance subcommittee. And so that committee now considers not just the investment income, but also expenditure and ways to maximise income. As Graham was saying, we need to focus on our financial deficit. While it's not a kind of crisis point at the moment, it's not really a sustainable situation to go forward with a deficit year on year. Otherwise, we'll be having to sell the family silver in order to cover the books. Charles Stanley have been working with us on investments, and I think generally, it's been quite a bumpy ride lately in the stock markets, but they've managed to keep us mostly ahead of the average kind of growth that you would expect. We also have introduced an idea that each of our committees within MCA should have a notional budget, and this is really not to sort of constrain other committees or force them to do things, but really to get them to consider finances while they're making decisions about what they would like to do with the money. We're also focused on good housekeeping, in other words, trying to keep our expenditure in check, but as Graham explained, that alone is not going to solve this deficit problem. We need to consider income generation. The journal, which is published by Oxford University Press, we have worked very closely with them. We've had a number of strategic away days with Oxford University Press, who I think have shown a tremendous commitment to our journal, and going forward would really like to see it growing and thriving. Obviously, the main thing about the journal is to try to increase its impact factor, because this will determine its sustainability, and the higher the impact factor, the more it attracts high impact type publications and so forth. So you want to be on an upward spiral rather than a downward spiral. We also want to widen the reach of the journal, partly as a way of attracting more income, but also attracting submissions. And the key market here is North America. And North American scientists in this field tend to like to publish in American journals. This is obviously a British or European journal primarily. But I attended a journal committee meeting over in Seattle this summer and met with Lorenzo Leggio, who's our new North American editor that we appointed this year. And also present were a number of our North American colleagues who are on the editorial board, and they were enormously supportive of the journal, and I think really value the uniqueness of it. It does stand out as having a unique contribution within the spectrum of all the journals in this area. So we're thinking of expanding the editorial board, particularly getting more North Americans onto it, also more ESBRA members, because the journal is also the official journal of the European Society for Biomedical Research on Alcohol, and we feel we could probably do more to connect with that society in order to also attract more submissions. We're considering translation of abstracts into other languages to attract a wider audience, particularly in the Far East. And Jonathan Chick is considering looking for sponsorship for supplements and special issues of the journal, which we've had before and actually has attracted quite a good surplus of income. The next area is publication strategy, and I think this was prompted really by what Dominique was talking about, an urgent need to consider the future of the handbook. Obviously the sales have been, and the distribution has been very successful, but I think there was a feeling that probably it's needing a refresh anyway, an updating, but also that soon we're going to run out of copies of the handbook, so we need to think urgently about what we do. So we felt that the Education Committee, which normally manages the handbook, as well as all the other things that it does, we felt that the Education Committee probably didn't have enough time in its agenda to really focus on the issue of how do we go forward with the handbook. So we've established a publications task force. And the purpose of that will be to find a short-term solution for the handbook, and this might actually initially be about just simply digitizing the existing handbook and making it available as an e-book or a PDF. It is available as a PDF, but it's not easy to read in that format, so e-book might be a way forward. But going forward for the next edition of the handbook, we're looking at developing a relationship with a commercial publisher. Now, you may not know this at the moment, but the current issue of Alcohol and Health was produced entirely in-house with help from the Royal Free Hospital's Medical Illustration Department and so forth. And so we don't really feel that's a very sustainable kind of way to go forward. But if we have an arrangement with a commercial publisher, they can handle all that stuff. They can also handle the marketing of the book further afield. And we feel that the book probably has potentially an international audience, which a commercial publisher would be able to help us tap into. But at the same time, we do want and we intend to make sure that the handbook is actually available free of charge to medical students, as that's part of the aim of our organisation. But it would be quite nice if at the same time it could be a profitable concern by being able to sell it through Amazon and through the usual channels. We're also considering widening the audience of maybe not just the handbook, but maybe other publications to professions allied to medicine, particularly nursing. And in fact, as an organisation, we have attracted nurses to work more closely with us. In terms of external relations, as Dominique said, we're not primarily a campaigning or advocacy organisation, but we do work closely with Alcohol Health Alliance, who've done some very effective work over the last year on a number of issues around alcohol policy, particularly managing to get the new chief executive of the civil service to divest himself of his directorship of the SAB Miller, which we thought was a slight conflict of interest for the head of the civil service to be receiving large sums of money from the alcohol industry. And they achieved a very effective campaign through an open letter in The Guardian to, I think it was to the Prime Minister. We also work with the European Federation of Addiction Societies, and this is an umbrella organisation which actually does advocacy work across Europe, and particularly working with the European Commission to try and campaign on improved care for people with alcohol problems, but also more effective alcohol policies. And I'm now on the executive of the UFAS Society. Where it's appropriate, we do work with other organisations, like we're talking to SMUG, which is, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a group based at St George's Hospital who have developed the medical curriculum in alcohol and drugs, and also the Society for the Study of Addiction. And I think we're planning to put on a symposium with them next year in the ISAM conference, International Society for Addiction Medicine. That will be held next year in Dundee in the autumn, and we're going to have a joint symposium on alcohol medical education in the undergraduate curriculum. So this is just our new committee structure. So the two that we've had for a long time are Education Committee, Journal Committee. Now we have Finance and a Publications Task Force. So changes of personnel, as I said, John Barrett resigned, and we're very fortunate to have Graham Warner, who's been appointed. We also have some resignations from the Executive Committee. Dr. McCann, who's here, Dr. Alistair Beattie, who can't be with us, and Elizabeth Murray. I'd like to thank all three of them for their contributions to the MCA over, in some cases, many years, particularly Alistair Beattie, who was my consultant head of firm when I was a medical student in Glasgow, who I remember very well from those days, and he didn't put me off medicine or alcohol at the time. But Alistair has made a contribution to MCA for longer than anybody in the room can remember, particularly as chairman of the Education Committee for many, many years. And we're most grateful to him for his contributions. We have 4 members standing for re-election to the Executive Committee: Anne McCune, Peter Rice, Alistair Young and Colin Payton. Could I please have a proposer for those 4? Robin Touquet. Could I have a seconder? Brian Hoare. Thank you. So they are duly re-elected. And finally, just to thank our sponsors, and do have a look at their wares. Some of them are outside during the break. You'll be able to see what they have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin. We're reaching the end of the AGM, but it's a very pleasurable end. One of the things that's delighted me over the last few years is the increasing coming together of our activities directly with medical students. I think in the past, years ago, we were a sort of distant body and with forays into undergraduate medicine, but not a very firm commitment in the way that it should be. And things are changing. And it's changing not simply because of what we're doing, but because of huge enthusiasm on the part of some medical students. And the quality of their input is measured in the magazine which they produce, the little Alcoholmania, which I think Domi mentioned in her statement. And if you want to know what the quality of their work is like in supporting what we do, then just take a look in the report, which I think all of you should have received. If you haven't, make sure you get a copy before you go, and just see what the winning essay this last time was. It was absolutely superb. So it's very impressive, and we're deeply grateful to those students who, through their enthusiasms, helped to keep this link going through BMA students and through individuals. And so we have 2 competitions, and one of them is an essay competition, one of them was constructing a website, and the quality of the candidates for this were really very impressive. So thank you, and thank you for coming this morning. Just one of you, as Yatwin Singh, is unable to be here for good reasons, but the others, we welcome you and we're delighted to have you with us. So the essay competition is Britain, the binge drinking capital of Europe. If you want to find out whether that is or not, read what I was just saying in the annual report. What factors in our national culture contribute to our drinking habits, and how may we change them? And the first prize goes to Louis Raymond. And the second was the lady who's not able to be here this morning. And thirdly, Sanjay Sivara well done, Sanjay. And Domi mentioned, excuse me, Domi mentioned the construction of the website, and the website has particular reference to what we're going to hear in just a few minutes' time, because when Alan Thompson comes and gives his reflection over a lifetime of study of tracking one of the important problems in alcohol disease, this was the subject that they had to create a website page for, to create a series of online web pages about Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. And the first prize goes to Ernest Lehman Imperial College. And the second prize goes to Edwin Evan Ra. Am I pronouncing it right? Yes. Thank you. I hope what all of you have done will encourage others to follow your path. I think that brings us to the point where we have a break. There is coffee, and those of you that had coffee before you came in are very welcome to coffee at the interval as well. The toilets are just along here. So if you would be good enough to rejoin us here when Colin will introduce our speaker at 11 o'clock.
No, it's
10:45.
10:45, is it? Sorry. 10:45, so that means you've got 20 minutes.